Now, James, the problem with a system of validation based largely upon opinion is what happens to that merit of the system when the individual reviewers become overwhelmed with personal bias. Now, it's easy to make that point if you imagine, I don't know, Stalin's economists being asked to peer review papers about capitalism. But when it's a bit more difficult, we look at it in our own culture where perhaps it's more subtle. Before we move to your next dramatic episode of peer review, do you have an opinion on when academic peer review started to collapse under the weight of politics? Has it always been this bad, or is this a relatively new problem?
Well, it's hard for me to give a really good answer because I've been publishing research since about 2008. And at that time, it was really more narrowly focused. I wasn't in the controversial areas that I'm in now. So I'm personally seeing a lot more right now, but that might also just be because I'm stepping into these areas of sex differences and men's health and stuff. I do get some good peer reviews. So I get some people that are very rigorous and scientific and strict and good, and that's great. But I can tell you that once you start to publish on sex and gender, that's when you start to see some pretty ugly, nasty things happening.
It sounds like you're describing the gates of hell just opening in front of you as you walk toward those topics. But it is good to hear that there is some decent people still in the industry. That is a relief, at least. Now, causing a female employee to flee her employment is not exactly the best experience for peer review. But you wrote another blog post about a 2020 incident where you said you submitted an opinion article to a high-ranking sports journal called Sports Medicine, where you, and I'm going to quote you, commented on the hot-button issue of female participant underrepresentation, end quote. Now, in the paper, you say you challenge the narrative within exercise and sports science that discrimination against women is the cause of fewer female than male participants in exercise experiments. Now, before I ask what happened, what was the material point you were trying to make? Can you clarify that for our viewers?
Yeah, so the idea of female underrepresentation in research means that, so when we conduct research in clinical trials, we have participants that come in and go through the interventions, and they may be male or female. So right now there is an ongoing kind of narrative. It is actually not just in exercise and sports science. It's been going on for decades in just medical science in general, that there's an underrepresentation of female participants in research trials. I can tell you that is completely false. That narrative is untrue. In exercise science, there is some degree of truth to it. But what has happened here is that those individuals that make that claim say that it's all about discrimination or bias against women. And all my paper was showing is that since going back to the 1960s in experimental psychology, we know that sex or gender sometimes correlates with willingness or interest to participate in research. So the individual man or woman themselves can self-select themselves in and out of particular research trials depending on what the topic of the study is, depending on whether the procedures have potential side effects, whether they might be painful or discomforting. And so that's kind of the backdrop. And so all my paper was doing was reviewing that literature that says there's good reason to believe that discrimination or bias against women is not the only potential explanation for why there might sometimes be fewer female participants. The women themselves might be self-selecting themselves out. They don't want to necessarily participate in some studies.
Well, women do that all the time. I mean, we certainly self-select ourselves out of garbage collection and working on the offshore mining rigs. There are definitely gender differences happening in lots of different parts of society that are not the result of being forced. It's just that, we'd rather not do it. But James, so far so good with your point. What happened after that?
Yeah, so this paper ended up getting sent out to 5 peer reviewers, which is a lot. Normally at this journal, it would go out to 3. I think the reason it went out to 5 is that the original 3 were a bit conflicted on whether they thought the paper was publishable or not. So the editor sent it out to 2 more. So 5 reviews is just a ton. It's a lot. And the 5th reviewer is the most irrational reviewer I've ever had in my years of peer review. And basically what they said is, data be damned. I know women are understudied. Perceptions trump data. That's exact quote from the review that individual sent to me. And there's just no hope at that point. If that individual, as I've said in my Substack posts, is cognitively unfit to serve as a peer reviewer for a scientific journal. Because then what is the point? If you can't be convinced by any data, then how do you determine who's right or wrong? So that's what that particular post was about. As a result of that paper got rejected from that journal. Long story short, I got it published in a different journal. The information's out there. People can read my review of this literature, but it was a pain to have to deal with that process, because I tried to appeal the paper, to appeal the review, because that person was so irrational with their review, but the editor still said, nah, we're not going to publish it.
So it doesn't sound like there's much of a control system in place. If a peer reviewer acts in a manner that is clearly not up to standard with what's expected of review, they don't seem to get removed or criticised or punished for that action, do they? So the system doesn't seem to be improving itself.
Yeah, look, I have no idea what action the editor may have taken afterwards. Maybe they kind of deleted that person from their email list. I'm not sure, but this is one of the arguments for open peer review. So when a paper gets published, the names of the people that reviewed it also get published on the title page. And this is sort of one of the arguments for that, is that it will make people a little bit more accountable for the types of reviews that they make. It also makes the journals more accountable for finding people who are actually like pretty qualified to review a paper. But the particular fate of this individual and how many papers they've reviewed since mine, I have no idea, but I just hope that the number is close to zero, because they shouldn't be reviewing any.
Yeah, I think the idea of naming reviewers is probably a good way of keeping track of accountability. It'd also really help you if you found out, one, if there was a great peer reviewer, or two, if there was a really dodgy peer review, you could go back to their previous articles and maybe reevaluate them. But the third part of this nightmare comes under the heading editorial safetyism and gender-based violence. This story takes place, I believe, in 2022, and you were, if I understand this correctly, leading a bid to challenge a piece in Sports Medicine called Gender-Based Violence is a Blind Spot for Sports and Exercise Medicine Professionals. Now, your letter was then, is this correct, sent out for peer review. Explain to those who aren't involved in the world of academia, why is this behaviour ringing alarm bells about the infiltration of this woke thinking?
Can you restate your question for me, Alexandra? I'm sorry, I didn't hear it properly.
So why is this behaviour of what happened to you in this third instance, why is that ringing alarm bells for you? Because people might not understand why things being sent out for this review is a problem.
Yep. So in this particular case, a letter, so what we're doing is we are challenging a paper that's been published. It was a pretty bad paper. That's why we challenged it. So we wrote a letter. Letters typically do not go out for peer review. They're only about 500 words, and they are always addressed at the very beginning, "Dear editor." So when you write a letter to the editor, it's just the editor who's meant to look at it and take a couple minutes to review it. As long as it's sensible and you're not involved in personal attacks, these letters have a high acceptance rate in journals. Our letter got sent out to 3 peer reviewers because it was on a controversial topic. And so we were involved in a bit of a debate, but basically the reviewers appreciated our letter, and that's great because it was very data driven. And ultimately we got our letter published, but it was not after this sort of safetyism of having our letter undergo peer review basically twice. So after we revised it the first time, it got sent back out. Then the authors of the original paper get a chance, and their letter got sent out to review. They eventually, for whatever reason, decided to not resubmit. So they just cut and run, probably because they knew that we had them pretty good and made them look quite foolish. But all of this time, from the time we originally submitted, was about 6 months until the time it was published. So here we are with a 6-month time frame where the ideas that they were pushing, which are complete rubbish, had 6 months to propagate throughout the field without being challenged, when it wasn't necessary to have so much safetyism about this topic. We were in the right, and it should have been published much sooner and informed the public much sooner of the problems of this paper. So this is an example of what I call Editorial safetyism, editors are getting scared about certain topics. They always tend to be about the sort of woke stuff, the gender stuff, and this is a perfect example.